It began with a letter, creased from the folds of time, resting on the mantelpiece in a quiet countryside home. The ink slightly faded, yet the words still whispering with clarity. It was the summer of 1914, and the sun warmed the fields with a gentleness that made the world feel still. The letter did not speak of mud or pain or sleepless nights. It was there that Thomas first saw the uniforms, the rifles stacked like wooden skeletons, and the officers with eyes that had already seen too much. Jokes turned quiet, songs faded. The sound of distant thunder began to replace laughter. That thunder, he soon learned, was not weather. The enemy trench was sometimes just 30 yards away. Thomas could hear the coughs of the men on the other side. His mother wrote about the garden, how the roses were blooming late, how the hens were still laying well. She never asked too much. She only said she prayed every night and kept his room just as he left it. Faces changed. Friends disappeared. New recruits arrived with wide eyes and clean uniforms, unaware of what awaited them. The sky above the trench felt vast, untouched by the ugliness below. They spoke little. Words felt too heavy. Instead, they listened to the quiet, a rare gift in a world that thundered. When Thomas finally slept, it was with dreams not of battle, but of home, of warm bread and sunlight on his face, of hands in soil and the rustle of trees. In the distance, the guns still murmured, but for now, his breathing slowed, and peace, however fleeting, wrapped itself around him like a blanket. Thomas no longer counted days. He counted breaths, sunrises, and moments of silence. He wrote in his notebook, not with grand words or heroic tales, but simple truths. Today it rained. Matthew laughed at nothing. A rat stole a biscuit. The enemy sang a song in the night, and we listened, too tired to hate. The monotony of trench life was broken only by bombardments or patrols. Sometimes they were sent into no man's land under cover of night to lay wire or retrieve the wounded. These missions were quiet, tense, and often without success. Every step felt like walking through a dream, where shadows moved and the ground whispered warnings. And he often wondered if they too sat in the dark thinking of home, holding letters from their mothers or lovers. Frostbite claimed toes, and illness spread like wildfire. Trenchfoot, a slow rot born from constant dampness, infected many. Thomas wrapped his feet each night, changing socks, rubbing them dry. Still, the pain persisted. One morning, as snow dusted the trench like powdered sugar, Thomas watched a robin perch on the edge of the dugout. It tilted its head, curious and unafraid. For a moment, he felt something stir within him, a small warmth, a memory of peace. He whispered a greeting, and the bird flew off, vanishing into the pale sky. The first time Thomas went over the top was at dawn. The sky was grey, and mist clung low to the ground. Whistles blew, and men climbed ladders into no man's land. He ran, heart pounding, legs heavy. Bullets sang past his ears, and the ground exploded in flashes of fire and smoke. Around him, men fell, silent and sudden. He reached a crater and dove inside, gasping, the mud swallowing his knees. He stayed there, frozen, until the order to retreat was sounded. Crawling back, he felt his body shake with a terror he could not name. It was artillery. The trench line was a world unto itself. Nights were the hardest. The darkness brought quiet, but also unease. Shells might fall without warning, and snipers watched through the moonlight. Thomas often lay awake, counting breaths, listening to the soft murmur of his friend Matthew beside him. Matthew was from Liverpool, loud and clever, always ready with a joke or story. He had a way of making the mud feel less heavy. One night, during a lull, Matthew whispered about his girl back home, how they had planned to marry in the spring. Thomas shared his dreams too, of building a house near the edge of the forest, of raising children who would never know war. Narrow ditches carved deep into the earth, lined with sandbags and planks, stretched like veins across the countryside. Mud was everywhere. It clung to boots, to skin, to breath. The smell of rot and dampness became a constant presence, one that no wind could chase away. Thomas was assigned to a small section with a dozen other men. They slept in dugouts, barely large enough for two, the ceilings dripping with cold water. Rats ran freely, bold and fat from feeding on scraps and sometimes worse. Training began at dawn each day. It was not the marching or the drills that wore him down, but the repetition. The endless routines meant to strip away the softness of civilian life and mold men into tools of war. Meals were simple. sometimes just a piece of bread and broth. Sleep was fleeting, broken by whistles and shouts. Still, Thomas adapted. He learned to clean his rifle without thought, to tie his boots in the dark, to stay silent even when his heart screamed with exhaustion. It spoke of duty and courage, of fighting for those you love. His mother cried silently when she read it. She knew, as all mothers did, that the world was shifting, and her boy would soon be part of it. Thomas packed a small bag with the essentials, a few pairs of socks, a worn photograph of his family, and a notebook to record his thoughts. He walked through the fields one last time, touching the tall grass, as if to hold the memory of it. The train ride to the front was filled with songs and laughter. Young men, full of fire and bravado, spoke of glory and imagined medals pinned to their chests. Thomas smiled with them, but inside he held a quiet fear, one he dared not speak aloud. The towns faded behind them, and the landscapes changed. Birds sang through hedgerows, and children laughed as they ran down dirt paths in the village. Life moved slowly then, as though time itself enjoyed taking long pauses between each tick of the clock. Thomas Elwood, a young farm boy with hands hardened by labor and eyes softened by kindness, sat under the shade of a tree overlooking his family's land. He had never seen war. He had only heard about it from the old men in the tavern, their stories thick with smoke and memory. His father had once fought in a smaller war years ago, but he never spoke of it, and when Thomas asked, he would only shake his head and say it was something best left to silence. But the letter changed everything. It came with orders and a badge of honor, calling Thomas to serve his country in what was being called a great and noble effort. Fields became fences, fences became checkpoints, and eventually they arrived at the staging camp. When orders finally came to move to the front, the mood shifted. In the trench, days lost their names. There was no Monday or Sunday, only hours marked by shifts, watches, and shelling. No man spoke of fear. It was an unspoken rule, but it sat in their eyes, in the way they gripped their rifles or stared at the sky too long. Letters came every few weeks, damp and stained, but cherished. Thomas read them slowly, savoring every word. Winter came with cruelty. The cold seeped through every layer, biting skin, stiffening fingers. The war stretched on, a line drawn longer with every passing month. One night, after a heavy shelling, Thomas sat beside Matthew and watched the stars. The morning light came slowly, filtering through the fog like a whisper. The trench was still, the ground slick from melted frost, and the men moved quietly, their breath visible in the cold air. The cook station was just a small makeshift area beside a crater, and smoke curled from the tiny fire like a ribbon of hope. Thomas stood beside Matthew, their shoulders nearly touching, both of them watching the mist hang in the air as they sipped in silence. He always greeted the men by name, asking simple questions, offering a kind word or a steady look. After sunset, Thomas and 4 others would crawl into no man's land to repair the barbed wire. Rain returned by afternoon, turning the trench floor into a river of filth. Duckboards shifted underfoot, and every step was a test of balance. Thomas helped Matthew clear a blocked drainage pipe, their hands cold and raw. They joked about the mud being thicker than stew and laughed when a rat ran over Matthew's foot. These moments, brief as they were, helped dull the edges of the day. Thomas dreamt of walking through a market, warm bread in his hands, the smell of cinnamon in the air. He dreamt of laughter, of voices calling his name. There were blankets, clean socks, and even a hot meal of stew and potatoes. Thomas ate slowly, savoring every bite. Someone sang softly, the words floating into the cold night like a lullaby. Matthew joined in, his voice off-key, but full of spirit. The trench was just as they had left it, waiting like an old friend with a heavy heart. New men had arrived. One was named Elias Jan, barely shaving, with a nervous smile and wide eyes. Not thunder, not shell singing, faint at first, then clearer. From the enemy trench, a melody, slow and mournful. German, but somehow familiar, a tune older than the war. The men listened, still and quiet. Then someone on their side answered, a British voice, low and soft, singing in return. No shots, no shouts, just music. Thomas showed him around, pointed out where the food was kept, where to keep his socks dry, and where the safest places were during a bombardment. But it was a different silence, not empty, not cold. Something had passed between them. His dreams were gentle, the kind that carried him home, a reminder that even here, In this place of mud and fear, men could still feel. Thomas listened, his eyes half closed, and for a moment he forgot where he was. He watched the smoke rise and felt warmth on his face. Then he woke, the dream fading, replaced by the soft drip of water and the distant thud of artillery. It was dangerous work. The enemy might open fire, or worse, send their own patrol. But it had to be done. He thanked his mother for the scarf she had sent, and told her about the robin and the stew and the harmonica. He told her that Matthew was well and still making them laugh. He did not tell her about the wiring party or the shadow and the fog. Some things, he knew, were best left unsaid. They would march to the rear line, a few miles behind, where tents and warm meals waited. The men packed quickly, eager for change. The march was long but familiar. They spoke quietly, their voices blending with the night. Matthew talked about the sea, how he missed the sound of waves and the taste of salt in the wind. Thomas said he missed silence, not the kind they had now, but the silence of peace, past craters, past burned trees, past the bones of places that once had names. Thomas sat in the dugout and wrote a letter. He told his mother that the weather was turning and that he had found a piece of chocolate tucked in his coat, a surprise from the last mail delivery. From across the field, a shape moved, a shadow shifting through the night. The enemy, maybe just one, maybe more. When Thomas dropped into the trench again, his legs trembled. He exhaled slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. Matthew clapped him on the back, grinning. Another mission done. Another night survived. No one fired. There was a code in these nighttime missions. As long as no one attacked, both sides pretended not to see. Still, the tension was thick. The shape paused, then slowly vanished back into the fog. He told her not to worry, that they were being well looked after, and that he still thought of the garden and the sound of rain on the roof. The wire was the first line of defense, and without it, the trench was exposed. The world outside the trench the ground was uneven, cratered and broken, scattered with remnants of old battles. Shell casings, scraps of uniform, twisted metal. Every shape in the dark was a question. Thomas moved slowly, knees bent, breath held. The wire was tangled and torn, and the men worked with gloved hands, clipping and threading, eyes always scanning the horizon. Thomas nodded when told, and he prepared in silence. He cleaned his boots, checked his gear, and wrapped a scarf around his neck. Thomas respected him. There were other officers who barked orders and stayed hidden in the rear, but Mero stayed with them, through rain and fire. He had a scar on his cheek, a thin line from temple to jaw, and eyes that never blinked too quickly. No one rushed. Time was strange in the trench. Sometimes it dragged, thick and heavy, and other times it vanished in a breath, especially when the shells fell. Thomas stretched his limbs inside the narrow dugout, his back sore from the hard wooden plank he had slept on. He reached for his notebook, ran his fingers over the soft pages, then tucked it into his coat. It was time to begin another day, though the word day had long since lost its usual meaning. Breakfast was a biscuit and a cup of black tea, bitter and lukewarm. That morning was a quiet one. The enemy line was still, only the occasional clang of a tin or a distant shout breaking the silence. This was the kind of morning when men stared too long at the sky, wondering if the clouds looked the same back home. Thomas thought of his sister, younger by 5 years, who had a way of filling a room with laughter. He pictured her running through the orchard, her arms stretched out like wings. He missed that sound. Captain Mero made his rounds, his boots coated in mud, his voice calm and low. That day, the orders were for a wiring party. The rest of the day passed slowly. As evening came, the light faded to grey. A soft wind moved through the barren trees, and smoke from a distant fire drifted lazily across the field. When darkness settled, the wiring party prepared. Faces painted with ash, coats buttoned tight, they climbed silently over the parapet. Half an hour passed, then a sound, a cough, not theirs. Thomas froze, heart thudding. The others stopped too, every breath, silent. The men finished their task and crawled back, every inch of victory. Sleep came in fragments. An hour here, 30 minutes there. Dreams mixed with memories, some real, some twisted by the war. The next day brought orders to rotate out, a temporary rest. The rest camp was quiet, with wooden huts and small fires burning in metal barrels. There was even music. A soldier with a harmonica played a slow tune, and others hummed along. In the hut, he lay on a straw mattress and wrote another letter. The rest lasted 3 days. Then they returned. That night, Thomas and Matthew stood watch. The stars were out again, and the air was crisp. Then, a sound. For a few minutes, the war stopped. The song passed between the trenches like a prayer. When it ended, there was only silence again. Thomas slept well that night. Morning returned with a soft drizzle and a sky the color of steel. The trench breathed its usual rhythm of quiet footsteps, low murmurs, and the occasional distant thud of artillery echoing like a memory. Thomas woke slowly, the chill of the damp air slipping beneath his collar. You knew something terrible was coming, but you rarely knew when it would arrive. What was it like during a bombardment? What to do if the trench collapsed? How long the war would last? Thomas answered gently, not wanting to frighten him but not wishing to lie either. He described the trench as best he could without making his mother worry. Water pooled along the trench floor, and the men took shifts bailing it out. Matthew made a game of it, joking that whoever bailed the fastest would earn an extra biscuit. His voice echoed with cheer, and for a short while, laughter rose above the storm. He told her about Elias, about the harmonica player, about the way the clouds looked when the sun briefly broke through. He listened to the wind. He listened to his heart. The sky above was clouded, and the stars were hidden, but he imagined them there, bright and silent, watching. He added that he had begun to forget what day it was, but he remembered home more clearly than ever. He kept apologizing, over and over, until Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he had done well. That was all it took. Elias closed his eyes and slept. He told Elias to keep his socks dry, to eat when he could, and never to forget who he was, even in the darkest hours. The trench seemed quieter than usual, the men moving with a heaviness that came not just from physical weariness, but from something deeper. It was quieter there, a little forgotten. He leaned against the wall and looked up at the sky. The clouds had cleared, and for the first time in days, stars blinked above. Thomas woke, sweating, heart pounding, but Matthew was there, sitting up, passing him a drink of water without a word. And that simple act made the world feel right again, even for a moment. By noon, the stretchers were full. The enemy worked in parallel, quiet and respectful. Occasionally, glances were exchanged. A nod, nothing more. But in that, there was something human, something true. He felt small, but in a way that comforted him. He sat alone afterward, silent, the candles flickering beside him. The trench walls held. The men settled into routine. Life continued, slowly, gently as war would allow. He did not write that night. He simply closed his eyes and tried to remember laughter. It was not uncommon, but it always felt surreal. One moment, enemies. The next, fellow mourners, small like a grain of sand in something vast and eternal, a weariness of the soul. Thomas sat with Matthew for a while. They didn't speak of those who had laughed and joked just hours before. He thought of their families, of the letters that would soon arrive. He whispered their names to the sky, not loud, just enough that the stars might hear. They simply sat, letting the rain fall, letting the silence say what needed to be said. A bullet had grazed his leg. Thomas pulled him behind a fallen tree, pressing a cloth to the wound. Matthew returned fire in the general direction, then shouted for retreat. Until then, you waited. Sometimes the waiting was worse. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and listened to the gentle patter of rain tapping the roof of the dugout like a lullaby. The earth smelled of moss and smoke. 5 men, including Thomas, Matthew, and Elias. With stretchers and cloth, they climbed from the trench and began the slow work, as if he had merely laid down to sleep. Thomas knelt beside him, placing a hand on his chest. Then he whispered a goodbye, the only thing left to say. The field was quiet. Smoke drifted. Crows circled above. Bodies lay still, untouched by time. Some were familiar, others were not, but each one had been someone. They were to scout a section of no man's land for damage to the wire and signs of enemy movement. The air was thick with mist, damp and silent. He joined Matthew for the morning brew, their cups warm in cold hands. The world outside the trench felt older, quieter, like a museum covered in fog. Thomas took a moment to catch his breath, then began sketching notes. As he did, a sound, a click, not from them. Then silence, the kind of silence that then a sharp crack. Gunfire. Shell craters dotted the land like open mouths. The bodies of trees, shattered and burnt, reached skyward like bones. With spades and timber planks, they worked steadily, mud sucking at their boots, water creeping up from below. Their breath came in gasps. By the time they reached the trench, 2 men were missing. One returned a few minutes later, face pale, mouth tight. The 5th did not. The air smelled of rotten rain. They worked in silence, the kind of silence that came when men understood each other without speaking. No one said much. Rain did that. It made the trench feel like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. The usual patrol was delayed. The mud was deep, clinging to boots, slowing every step. The walls of the trench were beginning to sag in places, and Thomas helped shore them up with extra sandbags. His hands worked by habit now, not thought. Every motion was practiced, repeated so often it lived in his muscles more than his mind. New rumors spread through the trench like wind. A major push was coming soon, though no one knew when or where. That was the nature of war. Elias, the young soldier Thomas had met just days before, asked endless questions. Later that afternoon, the officers called for a repair team to rebuild part of the trench wall that had caved during the night. Thomas volunteered. He preferred movement to stillness. That evening, Thomas sat alone, writing by candlelight. Night brought another rain, heavier this time. As Thomas stood watch that night, he listened to the sounds of sleeping men. The following morning began with orders, a patrol at first light. They moved slowly, crawling in low grass, careful not to disturb the mud or snap any frozen twigs. They found a spot where the wire had collapsed and stopped. They dropped flat, hearts racing. More shots followed, quick, scattered. Elias cried out. They moved fast, dragging Elias with them. Mud clung like glue. Elias was treated by the medic, his leg bound tightly, his face grim but thankful. The rest of the day was slow. Later, as dusk fell, Thomas walked to a section of the trench rarely used. He thought of the men who would never return. Sleep that night was restless. Dreams came fast, chaotic, full of flashes and echoes. The next day brought word of a ceasefire, a temporary truce to allow for the collection of the wounded and the dead. Thomas volunteered again. He found the 5th man from the patrol, face serene, eyes closed. They worked through the morning. Back in the trench, Thomas washed his hands in cold water, the dirt and blood swirling away like ink. Rain returned once more. Dawn arrived pale and distant, a faint glow that did little to chase the damp from the trench walls, the wooden planks groaning under the weight of night's moisture. Thomas rose, bones stiff from sleep, and ran cold fingers along his rifle's barrel, checking for mud and grit before tucking it safely. The morning rations were a thin soup of barley and meat, warm enough to stir the blood, but not enough to fill hungry bellies. Men huddled under oilskins, sharing whispered hopes that today might bring news of an armistice, though none truly believed it. Captain Merrow appeared, his damp cloak streaked with mud, eyes bright with purpose. He announced that the men would begin digging a new listening sap closer to the enemy line, a project that would take days of careful tunneling. The men paused to plan, laying wire and jigsaw-style metal plates for reinforcement. Captain Merrow inspected, nodding approval, then handed Thomas a candle, its flame trembling, and told him to mark progress in the notebook. Candlelight flickered on rough walls as Thomas wrote, "Dave, sap within 4 yards of enemy line. Spirit steady, earth endless." In that moment, the war felt suspended, 2 trenches united by shared music, by the simple act of human voice. Thomas and Matthew exchanged a look, neither speaking of the risk, only nodding, their faces calm. Shells struck around them, sending shards of earth raining down. The sun set in a blaze of blood-red sky, and at last they emerged, muddy and exhausted, into the trench. The bombardment continued into the night, each explosion a reminder of the fragility of their work. In the morning, he woke with mud on his face and hope in his heart. The tunnel would be sealed again, the message hidden, and the trenches would return to business as usual. But inside him, a quiet knowing remained, a promise that even in the darkest places, humanity could speak. Yet they took solace in survival, in the knowledge that they had shared a secret with the enemy, had built a bridge of earth between 2 sides of the same story. Thomas covered his head, chest tight with fear and exhilaration. He wrote of the collision of earth and metal, of the voices carried on the wind, of the shared breath through the tunnel's gap. He paused, then added a final line. "In the heart of war, we found communion." When the noise stopped, the sap mouth was half collapsed, wood splintered, Earth spilled inwards. The men pulled each other free, coughing, hearts racing. Captain Merrow shouted orders to rebuild, urgency sharp in his voice. The trench moonless, stars obscured by clouds. Every shadow became a question. German voices, speaking slowly, softly, as though reciting prayers. Thomas signaled the others to listen. The voices rose and fell in a cadence that felt familiar, a hymn perhaps carried from a church across the sea. No shots followed, only the song. The men in their trench responded quietly with their own hymn. English words carried on the same breeze. Thomas whispered lines of poetry he once learned in school, soft rhymes that eased the tension. Matthew hummed a tune, a song of home, and for a moment the guns felt distant. He froze, heart pounding. Mud shifted at the edge of the sapmouth, and a fragment of wood came loose. Thomas broke the biscuit in half, offering a piece to a new recruit, a boy from Manchester with wide eyes and unsteady hands. The boy bit into the bread, cheeks hollow with hunger, and managed a small smile. By midday they broke through into a small chamber, the final barrier removed, the cloth-draped wall between them no more. Thomas peered through the gap into a mirror image of their own sap wooden supports. Muddy floor, the enemy's tools neatly arranged. He took a step forward, Matthew beside him, and they touched the same earth, divided only by fate. Thomas told him a story of apple trees in bloom, of sunlight through green leaves, and the boy closed his eyes to picture it. He signaled Matthew, who replaced the splintered plank with a fresh board, hammering nails by touch. The moment passed, the danger diffused, and they resumed, breath steadying, resolve firm. They knew the work required silence, patience, and steady hands. By mid-morning, groups of 4 worked on shifts, picks striking earth with a hollow echo. The trench beside them alive with activity rats, scurrying, water dripping, soldiers on guard. Thomas crouched low at the sap entrance, chipping away at packed soil while listening for enemy digging, a soft counterpoint to his own labor. Every strike of the pick was a test of control. Too hard, and the tunnel walls might collapse. Too soft, and progress would stall. A sudden crack startled him, not from his pick, but from a snap above. Lunch was a biscuit and cheese, eaten sitting against a wall of sandbags, the sky overhead a blanket of leaden grey. Work continued until dusk. As light faded, the tunnel stretched closer to the enemy sap, only a few yards of earth between them. Night brought the longest watch yet. Thomas and Matthew took the first shift, leaning their backs against the trench wall, rifles ready, ears alert for any movement. Around midnight, a low hum began. At first Thomas thought it was wind in the wire, but then he realized it was voices, faint but clear. When the singing ceased, a hush fell. Thomas pressed his head against the mud wall, closing his eyes to hear the silence, the absence of danger. At dawn, the tunneling resumed, the candle's flame guiding each careful chip of earth. Progress was slow, but steady. A sudden crash above signaled incoming fire. The men scrambled back, ladders clattered, and the tunnel trembled. For hours they worked, shoring up walls, replacing beams, digging out the rubble. That night in the dugout, Thomas recorded the events with precise calm. Thomas slept with that thought, letting it unfold into dreams of open fields and soft grass. The first light of dawn crept into the trench, its pale glow revealing the aftermath of the night's storm. Planks had shifted, sandbags slumped, and puddles pooled where no one had expected. Thomas pushed himself up, every muscle aching from the day before, and glanced at Matthew, who offered a weary nod. He spoke quietly of an upcoming Radan early morning push to seize a small enemy post just beyond the barbed wire. Success would bolster morale. Failure would cost lives. The men exchanged looks, tension, and resolve mingling in their eyes. Thomas felt his chest tighten, but he said nothing. Craters loomed like wells, filled with dark water that reflected the stars. The raid lasted seconds, violent and precise. Men surged in, securing the farmhouse, while others dismantled enemy wiring and set demolitions. Thomas crouched in a corner, heart racing, looking at the ruined walls that once sheltered families. He felt a pang of sorrow before duty claimed him again. Every step was a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. Thomas hugged the ground, rifle-ready eyes, scanning for movement. The men prepared sandbag barriers and readied their rifles. Thomas checked his gear methodically, each step practiced until muscle memory carried him through. Shells screamed overhead, smashing earth. sending columns of dirt. The trench shook, and Thomas pressed himself against the wall, ears ringing. He counted each explosion, matching heartbeats to thunder. Time slowed, and then sped, every second stretched thin. He gripped his rifle, closing his eyes briefly, picturing the world as it had been. Sunny days, quiet fields, laughter carried on the breeze. Captain Merrow offered quiet praise, his tone grave. He reminded them of the fallen, reading names before a moment of silence. In that darkness, the trench felt endless, yet united in grief. He felt the sun on his face and heard the melody of a distant church choir. He reached out to touch a bloom, and at that moment, the dream paused, suspended between war and peace. Men emerged, shaken but alive, faces smeared with mud and sweat. Thomas waded through the wreckage, pulling a beam into place, helping to shore up the walls. Each act of reconstruction was an act of defiance, a refusal to yield to chaos. The post was a ruined farmhouse, its walls half collapsed, windows broken. The world outside hummed with insects and distant artillery, a lullaby of war. Matthews settled beside him, rifle resting across his legs. They spoke no words. Sleep was more precious than speech. A single sentry paced the edge, silhouetted against the sky. Thomas signaled to Matthew, who moved into position. He had faced the unknown before. Today would be no different. They both knew today would begin with repair and end with vigilance. He scrambled back across no man's land, every nerve alight, until he slid into the trench, chest heaving. Matthew followed, grin tugging at his lips, despite the tension. "We did it," he whispered, voice rough. Thomas nodded, too tired to speak. Thomas accepted a cup, letting the warmth slide down his throat. He sat under a small lamp, the steam rising like a promise. Matthew joined him, and they spoke of home in whisper. Thomas described the robin he had seen months ago, and Matthew recalled the church bells that rang every Sunday. Their words wove a tapestry of peace in the middle of war. A soft wind carried the faintest scent of flowers from fields miles behind, a cruel reminder of the world that waited beyond the war. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, and let the memory of honeysuckle fill him with calm. He opened them, ready to face what came. Orders came swiftly. A section of parapet had crumbled under rain and shellfire, leaving a gap wide enough for an unwelcome visitor. The trench resumed its rhythm patrols, repairs, letters, and watches. Thomas sat with his notebook and wrote the tale of the raid, but not the violence. He wrote of courage and sorrow, of the brotherhood that bound them. He wrote of hope carried in the darkest night. The men assembled tool shovels, hammers, fresh boards, and set to work. As they labored, the trench felt alive with purpose. Each man focused on strengthening the walls that shielded them from the sky's wrath and the enemy's gaze. Thomas drove a stake into the earth, the wood splintering under his blow, while Matthew pounded in a beam beside him. The men waited in silence, breath visible in the cold air, hearts synchronized with the ticking of their watches. At the signal, a single flare arcing into the sky, they moved. Over the parapet they climbed, into no man's land, where the ghostly fields lay under moonlight. The wire was intact here, the enemy's defenses formidable. Thomas and Matthew cut through the strands, hand over hand, breaths steady despite the pounding of their hearts. The rhythmic thud of hammer on wood was a small comfort, a heartbeat in the chaos. By mid-morning, the parapet stood firm once more. Captain Merrow inspected, running his hand along the top sandbag, nodding in approval. Throughout the afternoon, the trench buzzed with preparation. Rifles were cleaned, bayonets sharpened, and grenades counted. Night fell, and with it the hush before the storm. They advanced in pairs, creeping toward the target. In a swift motion, they struck grenade lobbed, rifle fired. The sentry dropped without a cry. By the time the flare signaled retreat, Thomas's hands were slick with sweat and mud. Back in the dugout, they counted the cost. 2 casualties on their side, 5 wounded. But the post was theirs, its barbed wire now neutralized. Sleep that night was different. A healer moved through the trench, offering bandages and hot tea. Morning arrived quietly, the raid already a memory fresh in every mind. Later, a new challenge arose. The enemy had begun a creeping barrage, artillery shells moving slowly across the landscape to drive the defenders from their positions. When the barrage began, it felt like thunder captured in steel. When the barrage lifted, the trench was transformed. Planks were splintered, sandbags torn, the earth pitted with fresh craters. As night fell, exhaustion claimed them. In the dugout, Thomas lay on the cold boards, too tired even to write. In his dreams, Thomas walked through a field of poppies, their red petals whispering in the breeze. The sky was a pale wash of dawnlight when Thomas stirred, the damp chill of the trench seeping into his bones. He rose slowly, muscles protesting, and ran his gloved hand over the rough-hewn wall, tracing the lines carved by time and toil. Around him, the men began to stir, Matthew yawning against the plank, the new recruit from Manchester rubbing frost from his eyelashes. Breakfast was a small loaf of bread and a cup of thin tea, but its warmth spread slowly through Thomas's chest, a comfort against the biting air. Captain Merrow moved among them with purposeful calm, announcing that today would bring relief in the form of mail and fresh supplies. The promise of letters sent a ripple of hope through the trench, and men straightened their coats, eyes bright, despite the years of mud and fire. Thomas volunteered, drawn by purpose and the promise of motion. No man's land lay before them, a wasted landscape of broken wire and silent craters. The men gathered, whispering coordinates, sketching notes on small notepad. Thomas marked each detail, the angle of the wire, the depth of the crater, the slope of the terrain. The world felt thin here, as though a breath might carry them into oblivion or glory. Thomas moved with measured steps, senses alert. The patrol spread out in a line, creeping forward, scanning for signs, tracks, discarded equipment, footprints. Rain fell in torrents, drumming on the corrugated sheets above the dugout. Thomas lay on the plank, water pooling beneath him, and closed his eyes to the rhythm of rain. The trench looked battered but unbroken, the men ready to rebuild. Thomas unfolded the page, reading headlines of battles far away and politicians speaking of peace. Thomas stared at it, its light unwavering. He whispered a wish, for safety, for home, for the war to end. Matthew reached over, clasping his hand, and they held quiet vigil, the star their silent companion. He folded it carefully, the printed words feeling both distant and hopeful. In the trench, the guns were silent for a few precious hours, and peace, however fragile, settled over them like dew. He shared the stories with Matthew, whose eyes lit up at the mention of negotiations in Paris. They read aloud in the dugout, voices low, imagining the end of the war and the return of peace. Thomas joined them, lifting sandbags, shoveling mud, each act a testament to resilience. By midday, the trench stood firm once more, a ribbon of dry ground woven between wood and earth. He thought of home, of a warm hearth, of the crackling sound of wood in a fireplace. He clung to that image as layers of exhaustion and coldness wrapped around him. The trench flooded, water rising to ankle level within minutes. Men huddled under oilskins, feet wrinkled and cold, voices muted by the storm's roar. Thomas waded through the water to help secure a barricade of sandbags, muscles straining against the current of mud. Thomas paused beside a shell hole, peering into its depths, and remembered the night he had lain there, gasping in fear. He watched the enemy soldier nearest him, noting the weariness in his stance. The flare flapped out, and darkness reclaimed the land. Without orders, both patrols melted back into the shadows, life spared by unspoken mercy. He inhaled slowly, pushing the memory aside. Thomas felt a curious mix of relief and longing, as though he had lost a chance at action but gained something deeper. He handed the sketches to Captain Merrow, who eyed them with respect and nodded. The group assembled at the sap entrance, counting rifles and checking ammo. Each man's face was set in determination, fear acknowledged but unspoken. When the delivery arrived, the mail carrier handed out bundles of letters and small parcels wrapped in brown paper. Thomas joined in, shoveling with steady rhythm, feeling the earth give way under each stroke. The sun edged higher, filtering weakly through clouds, granting a few hours of grace before the next gale of rain. Shadows moved, silhouettes of enemy soldiers emerging from the trench line. The patrol froze. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, almost in unison, both sides held fire. The enemy men stood in pairs, rifles lowered, as though they too hesitated at the prospect of killing mere silhouettes. Thomas received his with trembling fingers, a letter from his mother, the familiar looping handwriting bringing tears to his eyes. He sat against the wall and read of the garden, how the roses had bloomed twice this year, how the chickens had learned to follow his sister like little shadows, how the cows awaited his gentle voice at milking time. He closed his eyes to savor every word. The world outside, the trench dissolving into memory. After mail call, the men unpacked crates of chocolate, cigarettes, and extra socks. The simple luxury of a dry pair of socks felt like a blessing. Thomas and Matthew exchanged a bar of chocolate, breaking it in two as a silent treaty of friendship. They ate slowly, letting the sweetness linger, imagining for a moment that no shell would fall and no wire would be tangled. The morning passed in light chatter and repairs. A squad dug out a collapsed section, while another patched sandbags along the parapet. By midday, the message arrived. A reconnaissance patrol would cross into no man's land to survey enemy positions and capture a map. They climbed over the parapet just after lunch, boots sinking into soft mud, rifles ready. Ahead, a fallen tree provided cover. Suddenly, a flare shot overhead, painting the field in harsh white light. Thomas pressed himself against the tree, heart racing. Thomas remembered the night of the singing of shared hymns in the dark. The patrol returned to the trench with their maps, the mission deemed a success despite no shots fired. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west, heavy clouds rumbling with distant thunder. Sleep that night came in fits. The storm raged overhead, flooding the trench, sending small rivulets into the dugout. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving the world rinsed and bowed under a pale sun. Letters arrived again, this time from the front's chief reporter, bringing copies of the day's newspaper. That night, as they lay in the trench, a single star emerged through a break in the clouds. Thomas slept with the star's image in his mind, dreams weaving scenes of orchards in bloom, fields alive with song, and children's laughter carried on the wind. The dawn broke grey and soft, the light diffused by low clouds that promised rain later. The trench quiet except for the gentle drip of water from the sandbags. Thomas stirring slowly on the plank and pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders, the smell of damp earth and cordite lingering in his nostrils, a familiar cloak of war. He rose and checked his rifle for the 100th time, the metal cool under his gloved fingers, then stepped into the corridor where Matthew waited, breath visible in the chill air, eyes bright with a mixture of fatigue and determination, the bond between them a silent language. Orders came soon after, a rotation out of the front line for a few days of rest in the rear, tents awaiting, hot meals, and the promise of letters and blankets, a fleeting taste of normalcy. The men packed their kits methodically, boots laced, coats buttoned, each movement practiced, rehearsed, a ritual of survival. The march back was long but mercifully uneventful. The landscape a tapestry of broken trees and silent craters, each a scar that told its own story of fire and loss. Fields that once grew wheat, now churned into mud and ruin, yet in the distance beyond the devastation, Thomas glimpsed green hills and distant villages that felt like a dream. Blankets piled high on benches, laughter echoing strangely after weeks of silence, a reminder of the world beyond war. And for the first time in weeks, Thomas dreamed of home uninterrupted. His mind, painting vivid scenes of orchards in blossom and children playing in golden sunlight. Each bite a luxury, each word on the card a lifeline to the world they had left behind. Thomas wrote a reply in careful cursive, promising to cherish every memory and return as soon as he could. He opened his coat and found a letter from his sister, her handwriting looping with joy as she described spring flowers blooming early and the daily antics of their childhood dog, a simple tale that filled him with longing. Men prepared gas masks, straps adjusted and filters checked, each breath filtered through rubber, the world reduced to shallow gulps of air. Thomas practiced the ritual of donning and removing the mask until his fingers moved without thought. The men packed once more, hearts heavy but resolve unbroken, each step toward the trenches a march into fate. He spoke of teamwork and trust, reminding them that even in the face of chemical terror, they stood together. Men removed their masks and breathed freely, shoulders relaxing, the simple act of unfiltered air a gift. No one believed it fully, but the seed of peace took root in tired hearts. Thomas scribbled the news in his notebook. Hope grows in shattered earth. Thomas stepped into the trench corridor, chest rising and falling with each full breath, and closed his eyes, letting the moments linger. Thomas felt a surge of pride and relief, the camaraderie of shared danger, a balm against the horrors of war. Thomas pressed his back against the earth, heart hammering, the mask sealing his face and turning the air into filtered whispers, every inhale a testament to training and luck. They spoke of home again, of orchards and family, of sunlit fields far from mud and wire. They whispered a promise to find each other again on the other side of the war. Thomas gripped his rifle, eyes watering behind the glass lens, ears straining for any other threat. Then the whistle sounded again, the all clear. Men passed masks to each other, checking for leaks, coughing weakly, faces pale but alive. Thomas clasped Matthew's shoulder before climbing back into the mud, a silent vow passing between them. At the rest camp, wooden huts lined a muddy track, smoke curling from makeshift chimneys, a stove in each providing warmth, and the smell of stew and earth under a slate sky. The smell of rot and damp returning like an old song. New recruits had arrived, faces pale and eyes wide, and Thomas guided them gently, showing where to sleep, where to eat, and how to make peace with the mud. Thomas sat with Matthew by a barrel fire, spooning hot broth from a tin bowl, the warmth traveling through him like a pulse, an affirmation of life. They slept on straw mattresses bundled in blankets, the night silent, except for distant artillery that felt less threatening behind the lines. The following day brought a visit from the chaplain and a small supply of chocolate bars and postcards. The simple sweetness, melting slowly. Rest ended too soon. Orders arrived to rotate back to the front for another tour of duty. Back at the trench, the world was as they left it, a web of wood. That night brought a different threat. Orders warned of a possible gas attack at dawn, the yellow-green clouds that spelled suffering and death. When the warning whistle blew, the trench erupted in movement. Masks snapped into place, and the wind carried the first hiss of gas across no man's land. Minutes passed, like hours, as the gas drifted above. No shells falling, only the soft crackle of mustard gas settling into the ground. In the aftermath, Lieutenant Rivers moved among the men, offering water and reassurance, his voice steady. The next morning, the sky was clear, birds singing beyond the lines, an almost surreal chorus after the threat of gas. That afternoon, a patrol brought word of an armistice discussion in the capital. Rumors carried on newspapermen's tongues, flights of hope that fluttered through the camp like butterflies. Night fell gently, the trench calm under starlight, and Thomas and Matthew shared a final biscuit, the crumbs sweet and precious. As sleep overcame him, Thomas held his rifle close, but dreamt not of battle but of life regained. Our footsteps on soft grass and laughter carried on the breeze, believing in the promise of tomorrow. Dawn broke with a timid glow, pale light filtering through low clouds, the trench floor still damp from last night's rain. Thomas rising slowly on the hard plank, every muscle stiff yet accustomed to the chill. He slid into his boots, laces stiff with dried mud, and fingered the inscription on the photograph he carried, his sister's smiling face offering gentle strength in the grey morning. Breakfast was a thin porridge of oatmeal and hot water, a spoonful warming his chest as he ate beside Matthew, whose own gaze drifted toward the distant fields that once rippled with wheat. They spoke little, words unnecessary, between brothers, their shared silence a thread weaving them through another day of waiting. Captain Morrow's voice was steady as he outlined defensive measures, reinforcing the sap entrances, laying additional wire, and increasing watch rotations. Sections of parapet had collapsed, water pooling in craters that now marked the trench's margins. Men worked without pause, shovels scraping earth, boards repositioned, sandbags Thomas labored beside Matthew, their arms moving in tandem as though choreographed a dance of resilience against destruction. Thomas froze, finger on the trigger, but the figure only paused, as though sensing another presence. No shot rang out. Instead, a single word drifted across the distance, soft and foreign, but unmistakably a greeting. Thomas hesitated, then responded with the English hello voice barely above a whisper. He sketched the church ruins, the lone figure framed by a broken stone. He awoke to the first light of morning, the photograph of his sister warm against his chest, and felt the weight of another day's promise, to endure, to remember, and to hope. Thomas added notes. Date, time, the words exchanged. Their shared journal grew with each entry, a testament to moments of grace under fire. The men gathered tools and supplies, their movements practiced, each knowing his role as though by instinct. Orders came for a listening patrol near the church ruins, the same site of rumored enemy gathering. Thomas volunteered, drawn by curiosity and duty. He and two others crept through the trench's winding corridors, boots silent on duckboards, rifles cradled at their sides. Thomas paused, letting the warmth seep into his bones. As he watched, Matthew signaled to the overside guard that the new wire lay in place. The church spire jutted from broken walls, its stone edges etched against the sky. Thomas crouched behind a moss-covered tombstone, scanning the shadows. For a long minute, both sides listened, each man aware of the absurdity and grace of human connection amid war. Instead, he issued orders to maintain caution and watch. Thomas tucked the memory into his heart, a story of mercy and madness. The church bells no longer rang, but their echoes felt present in that moment. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, the figure stepped back, disappearing into the ruins. No shots followed. The air was thick with tension, each breath a risk, each heartbeat loud in his ears. A nod passed between them, a small victory in a relentless standoff. Orders arrived at mid-morning. Intelligence had tracked increased enemy activity near the ruined church at the trench's far end. Rumors of fresh troops preparing for an assault. The wire hissed under tension, sharp metal gleaming in the diffused light. Rats skittered through the mud, but the men barely noticed, eyes fixed on the task. Each strand added another layer of protection, a fragile barrier against chaos. Thomas joined a wiring team, hands steady as he uncoiled heavy spools of barbed wire, threading each loop through wooden stakes hammered into the earth. By afternoon, clouds broke and a weak sun warmed the trench walls, steam rising where raindrops hit mud. Shells fell in thudding crescendos, each impact sending tremors through the earth and rattling the sandbags overhead. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, rifle ready, heart pounding in time with the thunder of guns. He counted breaths, each inhale a promise to survive, each exhale a prayer for peace. That evening, the trench's calm was shattered by distant rumble artillery moving in waves across the fields. When the barrage eased, they emerged to inspect the damage. Night brought a hush so complete it felt alive, the faint drip of water and the echo of distant guns the only sounds. They climbed into no man's land under a crescent moon, the world bathed in silver. Suddenly, a figure moved near the ruins, helmeted head turning toward the patrol's flickering lantern. Silence fell. Then another voice answered, tentative and low. Back in the trench, Thomas's hands trembled as he relayed the encounter to Captain. The captain frowned thoughtfully but said nothing of reprimand. In the dugout later, Matthew produced a small pocketbook and a stub of pencil. That night, Thomas fell asleep dreaming of the church bells ringing again, summoning peace across fields of mud and wire. The dawn broke gently, a pale wash of light sliding down the trench walls. Thomas awakening on the hard plank, the sound of distant, dripping water composing a soft rhythm that greeted him before he even opened his eyes. The air cooled against his face, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and cordite, a familiar embrace of the front, and offered a quiet nod before they stepped into the narrow corridor together, boots clicking against the dock. Above, grey clouds drifted across the sky, promise of rain yet to come. And below, the trench lay calm, every plank and sandbag in place, a testament to yesterday's repairs. Thomas sketched their positions, noted the crate's markings, and recorded the time, every detail etched with calm precision. The enemy men froze, rifles raised, heads turning toward the sound. Thomas signaled the patrol leader, Lieutenant Rivers, who crouched beside him, hand on the man's shoulder. No orders were given, only a shared glance and a silent understanding. Remain hidden. Thomas placed the biscuit on the map table, a small trophy of silent victory. Men emerged to repair mud-shorn duckboards, replace broken planks, and realign sandbags along the parapet. The news traveled fast, smiles breaking across tired faces, laughter tentatively rising where silence had reigned. Thomas pulled out his notebook and added a final entry for the day. Day 99, rain and ruin. Thomas drifted into sleep with the last thought of home, picturing his sister reading his letters by the hearth, a smile on her face. In the trench, for a moment, peace settled like a gentle cloak, and rest awaited beyond the dawn, but hope in every detail found. He closed the book, slid it into his coat, and lay back on the plank, chest light with anticipation. Thomas felt the first genuine lift of spirits in weeks, the promise of rest like a balm to every aching muscle. Thomas joined a group shoveling fresh earth, the rhythm of the shovel a meditation, each scoop a gesture of defiance against the chaos that sought to swallow the trench. Matthew worked beside him, side by side in shared endurance, the bond of friendship forged deeper in each chore. The captain studied the map, traced the patrol's route with a fingertip, and nodded. He commended them quietly, reminding them of the importance of every detail gathered. Thomas felt a surge of pride swell in his chest, tempered by the knowledge that the war was far from over. The groan grew louder, wooden beams shifting, dust falling in lazy clouds. The soldiers in the ruins spoke in low tones, gesturing toward a collapsed archway that blocked their path. The sky darkened as clouds massed overhead, thunder rumbling far off, yet no drop of rain fell upon them. Thomas waited until their voices faded, then crept forward with the patrol, slipping through the gap in the rubble. Inside, the air was stale, dust motes dancing in the dark. The crates lay abandoned, their lids open. Thomas pried one corner and found tins of food, preserved meat and hardtack, along with a few bundles of blankets. He closed the crate gently, slid a biscuit into his pocket for proof, and marked the location on his map. A single drop splashed on Thomas's notebook, ink smudging slightly, and he paused to blot it with his sleeve. A small interruption in the quiet dance of observation. The patrol moved swiftly back to the trench, each man alert to every sound, boots sinking in stone and mud, rain falling in steady drums on helmets and coats. The wind carried the scent of wet wood and distant smoke, and Thomas inhaled deeply, anchoring himself to the moment. He rose slowly, every movement deliberate, and reached for his coat hanging on the nail by the dugout entrance, slipping into it as if drawing on its steadiness. Matthew stood waiting, silhouette outlined by the growing glow, his own breath visible in the chill. Captain Merrow emerged from the command post, maps tucked under his arm, eyes steady, voice low, as he briefed him on today's assignment. A reconnaissance patrol beyond the church ruins where the enemy had been observed, moving supplies under cover of darkness, the mission to confirm activity without engaging, to return with precise observations. The patrol pressed forward, rifles slung low, eyes scanning for movement, ears straining for sound. A cough, the scrape of metal, a footstep. They reached the church ruins, its stone spire fractured, walls half collapsed, shadows pooling in the empty windows. Thomas crouched behind a broken pew, pencil poised above his notebook, and watched as two figures moved within the ruins, carrying boxes and stacking them against a battered wall. The men gathered gear, notebooks, pencils, compass, and the barest ration of biscuits, and followed in single file, each step measured, every mind focused on the silent task ahead. They climbed over the parapet just after first light. The world outside the trench, a patchwork of mud and shattered wire, craters filled with rainwater reflecting the pale sky. Hours passed in hushed observation. The enemy men worked methodically, unaware of the silent watchers, their uniforms muddy, hats pulled low. Suddenly, a soft groan echoed from the ruins, a sound of shifting stone. After a tense minute, they abandoned the crates and moved away, disappearing into a side passage. They retraced their steps, emerging into the open as the first raindrops fell. Back in the trench, they reported to Captain Merrow. Afternoon brought a rare break in the rain. As the light faded toward evening, word came of an approaching relief. Another unit would take over the trench at dawn, granting Thomas's men a brief respite behind the lines. Night settled with a hush. The rain paused, and in the dugout, candles flickered as men wrote letters, read cards, and shared stories of home. Outside, the world seemed to breathe softer, the guns muted by distance, the wind carrying the murmur of the relief unit marching through the mud. The night air was cool and still when Thomas awoke, the only sound the gentle murmur of the relief unit settling into the trench boots, shuffling over wet duckboards, voices hushed in courtesy to the outgoing men. He lay for a moment, heart settled by the promise of rest, then rose, carefully mindful of those already packing. They exchanged a quiet smile before setting about gathering belongings, blankets, rolled rifles, cleaned notebooks tucked safely away. Each movement deliberate, practiced a ritual of endings and beginnings. Matthew stood beside him, pack slung over one shoulder, the photograph of Thomas's sister peeking from his breast pocket as if offering a blessing, and shattered trees. Yet in the distance, beyond the devastation, pale green hills rose gently, promising shelter and calm. They walked in silence, each man lost in thoughts of home, of warmth, of voices that waited beyond the war. Outside the trench, the relief soldiers moved in orderly fashion, faces tired but steady, their presence a balm to nerves frayed by months of vigilance. Thomas sat by an open door, notebook in lap, pen moving swiftly as he recounted the patrol at the church ruins. The shared song beneath the earth, the mercy exchanged without firing a shot. He wrote of the boy from Manchester and his smile, of the robin perched on a parapet, of the single star shining through clouds, each memory a seed of hope planted on paper. Thomas settled into a bunk, the straw mattress soft against his back, and closed his eyes, letting exhaustion sweep through him like a tide. Thomas accepted a small booklet of poems, its pages thin and fragrant with ink. The camp lay under a blanket of stars, the wind whispering through wooden slats. When dawn came again, he awoke to birdsong and sunlight filtering through the hut's window, and he knew that soon he would return to the front, that war still raged beyond these lines. But for now, he held the memory of rest close, a lantern to guide him through the darkness ahead. Thomas lay on his bunk, book resting on his chest, and closed his eyes, letting the poems guide him toward sleep. He dreamed of orchards in bloom, of family gathered around a table, of children's laughter echoing through open fields. He read lines about peace, about wheat fields golden under the sun, about laughter carried on the wind. The words wrapped around him, heavy with promise, and for a moment the world felt wide enough to hold both memory and dream. Thomas helped guide them through the corridor, showing where tools were stored, where fresh water could be drawn, how to navigate the maze of duck boards and sandbags without stumbling. The newcomers thanked him quietly, relief in their eyes as they claimed their new posts. By dawn's first light, Thomas's unit marched back toward the rear lines, the muddy track soft underfoot, the landscape a patchwork of crater fields. Thomas stood at attention, heart steady, mind at ease, ready to carry both memory and hope into the days to come. Each step a promise to endure, to remember the moments of grace, and to carry the light of peace into the darkest places. The rest camp greeted them with wooden huts and barrel fires, smoke curling lazily into the sky, a small orchestra of comfort replacing the percussion of artillery. Later, he joined others at the mess tent, soup ladled from a cauldron, bread fresh and warm, the taste of salt and barley, a reminder of kitchens left behind. He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, the chatter around him gentle stories of home, of gardens blooming, of letters received, of the day when guns would fall silent forever. Afternoon brought leisure, a chance to write letters, to clean equipment, to mend uniforms. By evening, the chaplain returned, offering prayer cards and quiet counsel. Night fell soft, without thunder or bombardment. He slept deeply, the first true rest in weeks, the trenches and wire and mud washed away by peaceful dreams. In the morning assembly, Captain Merrow thanked the chaplain and the support staff, then outlined the next rotation back to the trenches. Plans drawn with careful precision, the steel of duty tempered by gratitude for this brief reprieve. He shouldered his pack, adjusting straps until the weight felt familiar, then stepped into the muddy track, the rest camp fading behind him as he marched toward the front once more. The day broke quietly, a pale haze softening the edges of the trench as Thomas rose on the familiar plank, the slight ache in his back, a reminder of nights spent on hard boards. He stretched slowly, muscles loosening in the cool air. But until then, the men would hold the line, maintaining the wire, watching the fields, and preparing for any sudden assault, each loop tightening against the wind as if clutching at hope. The wires hiss, a quiet song in the misty air. They spoke little, voices hushed, trading small comforts, a sip of tea, a scrap of tabloid news that had circulated through the camp. Thomas unfolded a scrap of newspaper, the headline blurry but hopeful. Talks of diplomats meeting in Paris to discuss peace. The wind carried distant gunfire like a muted roar, but here in the lane, the world felt still as a held breath. Thomas sketched positions in his notebook, jotting compass bearings and ground cover descriptions, every line precise, every note a thread woven into the larger tapestry of war. Captain Merrow frowned, then spoke of adjustments, raising a firing step, adding a brace of sandbags, tightening the wire. Thomas helped reposition the duckboards and restack the parapet. Each shovel of earth and plank replaced a small assertion of control. He read the words aloud, slow and measured, letting the syllables settle in the cold air, then folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat. Instantly, the patrol dropped to the ground, rifles ready, hearts pounding in unison. Thomas joined them, tearing off chunks of bread to dip in stew and passing around small tins of jam. The camp was still but for the crackle of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Thomas lay in his bunk reading the chaplain's poetry, each line a gentle bridge from mud to meadow, from gunfire to birdsong. His eyelids grew heavy, the words dissolving into dreams of orchards, of gardens lush with roses, of sunlight dancing on river water. In the quiet of the support lines, he slept, carrying peace within him until dawn would call him back to duty once more. They spoke of home. One man's brother learning a trade in Manchester, another expecting their first child in spring. Laughter came easy, voices rising like soft music under the darkening sky. Thomas listened, full of gratitude, the stories threading into his memory as lifelines to a world beyond war. Thomas pressed his cheek against the stark, listening for movement, counting breaths. The world paused, a moment of absolute tension before the sniper fell silent. Lieutenant Rivers signaled to withdraw. As he walked, the world shifted, the constant echo of war faded, replaced by the murmur of flowing water in drainage ditches and the occasional bird call. He chose a corner bunk near a small window and stowed his gear. Outside, the sky flushed with sunset, hues of rose and gold painting the clouds, a vision impossible in the trenches. Thomas pressed his forehead against the glass, breathing deep the scented air of pine and damp grass, and let the colors fill him with calm. He felt the weight of his pack lighter, the promise of rest drawing near. They moved steadily, rifles cradled, eyes alert to every ridge and sap. The trench drained slowly after last night's rain, water spiraling down duckboards and flowing toward makeshift drains. Thomas paused to clear a blocked gutter, fingers numbed by cold, and watched a small robin perch on a post, its red breast vivid against the grey, a brief spark of color in the muted landscape. The relief unit appeared at the trench lip, rifle slung and faces weary, ready to assume the posts. Thomas handed over his section, pointing out recent repairs, the blocked drain now cleared, the new wire strung taut. The newcomers thanked him quietly and took their stations. Captain Moreau's voice carried over the corridor, steady and calm as he assigned duties. Thomas volunteering once more for the wiring detail, drawn by the certainty of purposeful labor in a world rife with uncertainty, and reached for his coat as Matthew emerged beside him, their movements synchronized by habit and unspoken understanding, the trench around them exhaling the scent of damp wood and cold earth. Orders arrived just after first light, the relief unit due to return at dusk. By mid-morning he and two others worked along the sap's lip, uncoiling fresh, barbed wire and threading it through newly driven stakes. Lunch was a shared tin of corned beef and hot, eaten beside Matthew, whose own gaze lingered on a distant ridge where the enemy trench traced a thin line. Afternoon brought the usual patrol rotation. Thomas joined Lieutenant Rivers and 3 men for a daytime reconnaissance of a sunken lane rumored to offer easier passage in advance. They climbed over the parapet, rifles slung, eyes scanning for tripwires or hidden posts. The lane lay across a shallow valley, its banks lined with shattered planks and broken corrugated iron. Thomas moved with measured steps, each foot placed deliberately on firmer ground. The world outside the trench at once expansive and treacherous. They followed the lane's curve, mapping its width, noting shell craters at regular intervals and marking points where concealment might be found. A sudden crack echoed a nearby sniper's rifle, the shot aimed too low, burying the bullet in mud harmlessly. Back in the trench, the patrol reported their findings and the failed shot. The evening approached with its customary hush. Thomas stepped back, packle on shoulder, and followed the lane of duckboards toward the rear, each board rising and falling like the gentle hills beyond. At the support lines, he found the rest camp once more, huts with straw mattresses, blankets piled high, oil lamps glowing warmly. Later, around a barrel fire, men gathered to share rations and news. Night fell softly. Dawn's first light found the trench cloaked in mist, each plank and sandbag softened by the rising haze. Thomas stirring on the narrow plank bed, fingers brushing the cold metal of his rifle for reassurance before slipping it gently into its stand. The muted world around him a silent hymn to end. An outline today's orders, a digging detail to extend the sap network toward a nearby ridge, strengthening listening posts and creating an advanced position for future patrols. The men gathered picks and shovels with practiced efficiency, each tool a tether to purpose, and set out to work beneath the diffuse morning light. He rose carefully, mindful of the groan the wood might give, and joined Matthew in the corridor, their breath mingling in the cool air as they prepared for another day etched in earth and resolve. Captain Merrow emerged from the command post, maps in hand, eyes steady with purpose. Captain Merrow inspected the progress, running a gloved hand along the timber supports, nodding in approval before issuing orders to shore up the walls with extra planks and to prepare for a nighttime listening post. Thomas marked the day's progress in his notebook. Day 120. Sap extended 50 yards, spirit steady, earth patient. Thomas descended into the sap entrance, the wooden planks damp underfoot, and struck earth with his pick in a steady rhythm. Thomas accepted a tin of jam from Matthew, spreading it thickly on hardtack, and savoring the sweetness that felt like sunlight on the tongue. Around him, the camp settled into a quiet rhythm. A healer moved among the wounded, a chaplain prayed softly in a dugout corner, and rats scurried beneath tables, their bright eyes reflecting lamplight. And once, the low melody of a hymn sung in the dark. Thomas pressed his cheek against the wood of his notebook cover, tracing the warm leather with his fingers, and thought of home, of church bells and choir voices rising in unison. Thomas worked alongside a miner-turned-soldier, a man from Cornwall who spoke of deep shafts and lantern-lit caverns, his stories weaving warmth into the cold earth, and slipping back into the trench, hearts light with the shared song beneath the ridge. Thomas strapped his boots and stepped into the corridor, the lantern's glow fading behind him, carrying the memory of voices and the promise of peace into every swing of his pick. They wrote of voices carried on the wind, of shared hymns in darkness, and of the fragile thread that bound enemies in a moment of peace. In his dreams, the church bells rang once more, calling souls from mud and wire to fields of peace. Thomas paused, then added, "In the hush of earth, we heard our own hearts spoken." Captain Merrow awaited them, his gaze thoughtful as he listened to their report. No orders for retaliation followed, only a quiet acknowledgement of common humanity. From the darkness, a faint reflection answered, then faded. Thomas lowered the mirror, heart steady, and opened his notebook to record. Voices on the wind, unbidden and soft, a bridge in silence. Thomas, Matthew, and 2 others prepared, donning coats and scarves against the chill and fastening their rifles. Above them, the ridge loomed, its contours softened by darkness, and between their position and the enemy trench, the land lay quiet as a held breath. Thomas closed his eyes and listened. The whisper of wind, the distant call of an owl, and beneath it all, something softer voices carried on the breeze, German words murmured like prayers. Lantern in hand, they climbed the sap ladder and emerged into no man's land, careful to stay low beneath the ridge's shadow. The world outside felt vast, the trench line a distant hum, and the air tasted of damp grass and approaching night. They shared biscuits and tea by the flicker of a single lamp, the light reflecting on damp walls and creating dancing shadows that felt like ancient spirits guiding their hands. The tunnel walls closed in around him, wooden braces arching overhead, the scent of fresh cut wood mingling with damp soil. The world beyond the sap felt almost serene, a stark contrast to the confined tunnel where every breath carried the weight of pressure and caution. Thomas paused to wipe sweat from his brow and leaned his cheek against the cool timber, eyes closed to imagine open air and the sound of wind in trees. Each chip of earth was a conversation with the land, carving a path deeper toward the unknown, every movement measured to prevent collapse. Above, the trench hummed with activity. Ration parties moved along duckboards, mail carriers delivered newspapers and letters, and fresh recruits practiced drilling in the muted light. Hours passed in silent labor, the sap growing longer by the foot, each swing of the pick a testament to By midday, the sap had reached a point just 50 yards from the ridge. The afternoon brought a lull in work, the men emerging into the trench to stretch stiff limbs and share small comforts. As dusk approached, orders were issued for the listening post. They settled behind a fallen tree trunk, rifles ready, ears straining for sound. He signaled Matthew, who lifted a small mirror to catch moonlight and flashed it toward the ridge, a silent code they had devised. Minutes stretched into hours as they watched and waited. Occasionally the night air carried the scrape of boots, the clink of metal. When the all-clear signal came, they withdrew as silently as they had arrived, descending the sap ladder inside the dugout that night. Thomas and Matthew sat by a small lantern, adding the night's events to their journal. He fell asleep with images of the fallen tree and the ridge's silhouette etched behind his closed eyes. Morning found the trench calm, the sap sealed against collapse, and the men ready for another day of routine repairs, watch, and the quiet maintenance of hope. They waited through the pale dawn for the sap to settle. The hush of the trench broken only by distant bird calls and the soft drip of water from the sandbags. Thomas emerging from the tunnel entrance, boots sinking into soft earth, the morning air crisp against his face, carrying the promise of rain yet to come. He paused to inhale deeply. They exchanged a nod before descending again into the timbered tunnel. The lantern's flame quivering against the low ceiling, shadows flickering on rough walls as they advanced deeper toward the ridge, the scent of wet wood and damp soil grounding him, as he prepared for another day's work beneath the grey sky. And each swing of Thomas's pick rang clear, earth giving way under steady pressure, the tunnel inching forward like a patient beast, every chip of soil a testament to resolve. Thomas paused for a sip of tepid tea from a flask, the bitter taste a comfort, its warmth flowing through him like silent prayer. Captain Mero visited the entrance, inspecting progress, his gloved hand brushing damp timber, eyes thoughtful. He spoke quietly of orders to extend listening posts, and perhaps open a narrow observation slit once they emerged. Thomas nodded, anticipation and caution mingling in his chest. He passed the flask to Matthew, who tipped his head back, eyes closed, letting the moment sink in. Outside, the ridge loomed, its silhouette soft by mist, and the trench felt small, a winding scar beneath the looming earth, and dreamt of orchards heavy with apples, of church bells ringing in clear air, of fields alive with color and song. In the sap beneath the ridge, he slept peacefully, holding the promise of dawn in every breath. Thomas stood for a moment, letting the rain wash mud from his face, and felt the weight of months lift briefly as he gazed toward the horizon. He reached into his coat for the notebook and wrote, Day 121, Earth yields to light, rain sings of peace, taps echo beyond the wire. In the dugout, they shared a biscuit, its crumbs sweet against the bitterness of tea, and spoke softly of the day when taps would call no more to arms but to rest. They paused mid-span to shore up a weakened brace, hammering nails by touch, with splintering softly, then moved on, the world above a distant memory. Matthew joined him at the sap lip, carrying fresh lantern oil and a bundle of planks, their movements wordless and practiced, a dance of endurance in a landscape carved by steel and mud. Daylight barely touched the sap's entrance, but inside the timber supports glowed warm with lantern light. Thomas and Matthew climbed out to test the air, each breath unmasked, unfiltered, the first true inhalation of open sky in weeks. The world felt vast and trembling with possibility. They listened to rain patter on canvas and wind whisper through broken trees, and in the hush they heard distant voices, a lone bugler playing taps somewhere beyond the lines, notes trembling on the wind. Farther in, they found remnants of an older trench, timbers charred and collapsed, the ground stained dark where water pooled. Thomas knelt to trace bootprints in the mud, footprints frozen in time, and wondered at the lives that once walked here, hopes carried and buried in the very earth they now carved through. He noted the prints in his notebook, size, depth, direction, simple details that gave voice to ghosts. Matthew lit a second lantern ahead, its glow revealing delicate ferns sprouting from the damp walls, a quiet reminder of life's insistence even underground. Thomas reached out to brush a frond, its green vivid against the brown, and felt a surge of something gentle stirring within him, a reminder that even in war, beauty could persist. They worked through midday, the air thick and heavy, each breath a small victory, chest pressing against smudged ink and smoothed leather covers of the notebook. As afternoon wore on, the sap approached the ridge's heart, only a few yards of earth between them and the surface. They toiled until dusk, each stroke of the pick echoing through the tunnel like measured drum beats, then emerged into the open as a light drizzle began, soft droplets painting the trench floor. That night, they set lanterns at the sap mouth and lined sandbags to protect the opening. Thomas closed his eyes to savor the melody, letting it seep into his bones. They secured the sap for the night, extinguished the lanterns, and climbed back into the tunnel, each step carrying the echo of the bugle, its sorrowful song lingering in the damp air. Thomas lay on the plank that night with rain pattering overhead, notebook closed at his side. The pale dawn light filtered through the mist, softening each contour of the trench. Thomas, rising from the hard plank with practiced ease, the ache in his shoulders, a familiar whisper rather than a shock. He wrapped his coat tight against the chill and stepped into the corridor. Matthew stood waiting, their eyes meeting in silent acknowledgement of another day's labor ahead. Breakfast was a thin broth of barley and a piece of stale bread, yet its warmth spread gently through Thomas's chest, a comfort against the damp air that clung to every surface. The men gathered tools and lanterns, each item secured to their belts, and descended once more into the timbered tunnel, the lantern glow guiding them through the low-ceilinged passage toward the fresh earth they had carved. They ate side by side, backs against the sandbags, listening to the distant call of a lone crow, an odd but welcome herald of morning. Captain Merrow appeared with the day's orders. The sap extension must be reinforced in a narrow observation slit cut into the ridge wall at first light. Inside the sap, the air was thick with damp and the scent of pine supports. At the designated point beneath the ridge crest, Thomas and two comrades removed earth in careful scoops, widening the aperture until slivers of sky peeked through. The slit was narrow just enough for a periscope or a single-eye, but it promised a view beyond the trench's confines, and exchanged news with a wiring team, sharing a flask of hot tea and a handful of biscuits. Through its lenses, Thomas saw fields of flattened wheat, a distant church spire, and beyond, a line of trees that marked a road to somewhere unnamed. He traced the horizon with his gaze, imagining carriages and footpaths, where now only wire and shell pockmarks remained. The surface world was grey and still, the trench walls lined with fresh wire, and the men spoke of home with quiet reverence, each story a beacon amidst the mud. In his dreams, he walked along the distant road he had seen, surrounded by children playing in wildflower fields, laughter carried on the wind unhindered by barbed wire. The afternoon sun had broken through clouds, casting warm light on mud-splattered boots and worn faces, and memory, bridging trenches with hope and story, one measured step at a time. Repairs were made to splintered duckboards, and fresh sandbags were added to the parapet. Thomas lent a hand to a new recruit, showing him how to clear drainage channels and keep boots dry, a small kindness that carried the promise of comfort. Thomas struck earth with his pick in a slow, steady rhythm, each tap a measured note in the quiet symphony of tunneling. The world beyond lay silent, only the whisper of the wind disturbing the wire. Captain Merrow greeted them with hot tea and words of quiet praise, reminding them of the difference each observation could make. Thomas sipped gratefully, the warmth seeping through his gloves, and let the day's weariness settle into a contented calm. They watched cargo carts trundle along a distant path, heard muted voices carried on the breeze. We stand witness to both ruin and promise. He added a sketch of the ridge silhouette as seen through the periscope, the broken church spire a jagged promise on the horizon, and felt a stirring of hope that the war might one day be recorded merely as history in these fields. Matthew followed behind, fitting each new plank into place with the thud of his hammer. The tunnel stretched farther still, walls closing in, the world above reduced to a distant memory. Mid-morning brought a pause for tea and communication. They climbed the ladder to the auxiliary trench, returning to the sap. Thomas marked progress in his notebook. Day 130. Tunnel extends 200 feet, hearts anchored by purpose. He paused to blot ink, and felt the weight of each word as though it pressed meaning into the damp leather covers. As afternoon light waned, they prepared for the slit's opening. They capped the edges with splintered wood to prevent collapse, then lowered a small periscope provided by the engineers. When the observation work was done, the men climbed out of the sap to inspect the larger trench. Evening brought the routine night watch. Thomas and Matthew took first shift at the observation slit, rifles set aside, eyes glued to the periscope. After 2 hours, they swapped with another pair and descended to the dugout. In the deep night hours, Thomas wrote in his notebook by the flicker of a single candle. Through this small opening, the world breathes. He closed the notebook and stowed it in his coat, then lay on the plank bed, the gentle hum of distant artillery, a reminder of the world they still navigated. At dawn, he would rise again, pick in hand, heart steady, to continue carving earth.